We know of nothing in Scripture to invalidate the argument now presented, of no precepts or instructions trending to limit the meaning of those now adduced. The only facts mentioned in the Bible that require notice as seeming to have an adverse bearing on our argument are those contained in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, where the kings of Media and of Persia are recorded to have made grants from the public treasury towards the rebuilding of the temple at Jerusalem and restoring the worship of God in it. Whatever use may be legitimately made of these facts in the argument with those who hold it to be an unrighteous thing for a civil government to devote any portion of the public money to the support of religion, and unlawful for the church under any circumstances to accept of such aid, they appear wholly irrelevant if employed to prove the lawfulness of union between the church and an immoral civil government. There is no analogy between the cases as would admit of arguing from the one to the other. In order to make out the parallelism, it would require to be proved, first, that the grant of support by the Persian government was not temporary but intended to meet a present emergency. Was not temporary and intended to meet a present emergency, but permanent. That the priests and Levites had agreed to become stipendiaries of the Persian kings. Secondly, that as a qualification for receiving this support, the priests and Levites were required to give oaths of allegiance and loyalty to the Persian rulers or to homologate a corrupt civil constitution. Thirdly, that a Jewish church was incorporated with the state so as to make it an integral part of a complex constitution. Fourthly, that the relation was so contrived as to secure to the civil rulers a control or supremacy over the church, in virtue of which they might nominate the priesthood or regulate the manner of their appointment, interfere with ecclesiastical arrangements, and, on some occasions at least, issue their orders in regard to the public worship of God. Even if these things were proved, the impossibility of reconciling the case with the great mass of evidence abounding in Scripture, all leading to an opposite conclusion, would compel us to regard the case as altogether peculiar and extraordinary, and by no means designed as a pattern for imitation in after ages. But it is presumed that these things never can be proved, and therefore the analogy totally fails. There is another case mentioned in Scripture, to which that under review bears a much closer resemblance, namely, the case of the Israelites when they came forth out of their protracted bondage in Egypt. In both cases the seed of Jacob had been pillaged and oppressed. In both cases the hand of the Lord was conspicuously seen in disposing their oppressors to permit them to go free, and to make liberal presents and contributions to them at their departure. And in both cases some part of the wealth thus received from the heathen was consecrated to the service of God. But neither the one nor the other can supply any solid argument in defense of union between the church of God and an immoral or heathen civil government. It is important, moreover, to observe, even in the case of rebuilding the temple at Jerusalem, that when the people of the land came to the Jews and offered their assistance in the work, professing to be worshippers of Jehovah, that Zerubbabel and Joshua, and the chief of the fathers, unanimously and resolutely declined their aid, because they had no confidence in the character of their allies, and had reason to suspect that some sinister design lay concealed under this specious proffer of friendship. Ezra, the 4th chapter. Thirdly, we pass to the argument from experience, which we are obliged to treat with the utmost brevity. By the divine appointment, the Jewish commonwealth exhibited to the nations an example of an alliance between church and state, and of a civil polity so framed as effectually to promote the interest of the church, without church and state being blended together, or the one invading the province of the other. It seems difficult to conceive how one can arise from an attentive perusal of the sacred history without being thoroughly convinced on the one side that the interests of religion may be exceedingly promoted by the fostering care as well as by the example of enlightened and pious kings, and on the other that nothing can more effectually or speedily debase and corrupt the church than the wicked interferences of ambitious and ungodly civil rulers. The efforts employed by David and by several of his descendants, by Asa and Hezekiah and Josiah, and after the captivity by Nehemiah and Zerubbabel, to reform the nation and to revive and diffuse the power of godliness, were productive of incalculable advantage. And on the other hand, the impious establishment of Jeroboam and the influences and authority of his successors precipitated the 10 tribes into the lowest depths of profligacy and idolatry. Quote, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king, and Jeroboam drave Israel from following the Lord and made them sin a great sin. For the children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam which he did, they departed not from them, until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight." Unquote. 2 Kings 17, verses 21 through 23. The history of the Christian church during the first 3 centuries throws no light on the question under discussion, as during that period the church had no alliance with the state. It was in the beginning of the 4th century that the empire was revolutionized by Constantine. Under his reign and through his agency, paganism was generally suppressed throughout the Roman Empire. The worship of idols was publicly interdicted. Heathen temples were converted into Christian churches. Heathen judges and magistrates were degraded, and their offices assigned to the professors of Christianity. And the storm of persecution, which had raged so long and so fiercely, was hushed into a calm. Had Constantine and his successors been men of truly Christian character, enlightened and discriminating in those matters which concern the glory of God, there was no doubt opened up to them a sphere of usefulness, the most magnificent, perhaps, that was ever presented to mortal men, the apostles only being excepted. But however distinguished some of these emperors were in other respects, they were wholly destitute of that heavenly wisdom and spirituality of mind which were indispensable to the right improvement of the momentous crisis which, in the providence of God, came into their management. It would be unjust and ungrateful not to acknowledge that the immediate and proximate consequences of the revolution under Constantine were, in many respects, happy and beneficial. But it must be either ignorance or perverseness that can deny that the ultimate results of the system introduced by him were exceedingly disastrous and all but ruinous to the cause of Christianity. The emperors of that period, it is true, expended immense labor and cost upon the Church in constructing for her an ecclesiastical government after the model of the civil government of the empire, in extending the foundations and elevating the towers of a gorgeous hierarchy with its bishops and archbishops and metropolitans and exarchs and patriarchs and a long gradation of church officers of inferior rank, in adjusting the rivalships and animosities of an ambitious priesthood, and in gratifying the unchristian zeal of contending parties within the church when they demanded the execution of civil penalties on each other. But all this labor and expense were worse than thrown away. The obvious effect was that all that was vicious and corrupt in the church before was now prodigiously aggravated and increased. Revenues and dignities and the favor of civil rulers were the main objects of ambition among the clergy, and pompous forms and superstitious observances supplanted religion among the people. The grand impediment to the growth of the apostasy was now removed, 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 7, and the man of sin rapidly advanced to that gigantic strength which made him a terror to the whole earth, and prompted him to exalt his usurped authority into blasphemous competition with the throne of God. It would be a superfluous task to prove that the union which has subsisted between the apostate Church of Rome and the civil governments of European nations for more than 1,000 years has been a source of infinite evil to mankind. It is almost universally acknowledged by the Protestants that it was by means of this union that error and superstition in the Church and despotism in the state were upheld and perpetuated. The secular powers were ever ready to draw the sword to silence complaints against either the doctrines or the lives of the priesthood. How many noble efforts to awaken the nations from their fatal lethargy, to expose the errors of popery, and to draw the attention of men to the study of the Bible have been in this way suppressed. How many patriots, and martyrs have been sacrificed. How many promising Christian societies have been searched out and destroyed. The infamous harlot, in splendor and costly attire, with the golden cup of delusive error, would have possessed most formidable powers of seduction had she been alone and unassisted. But by becoming the favored mistress of the civil rulers, her ability to do evil was immensely increased. Then her jealousies and resentments and capricious passions could call a power into action that rendered them tremendous.